It is good to be back with you for another day as we continue on in our journey through the book of Nehemiah. This reConstruct Bible study is brought to you courtesy of Christ Table. If you'd like to know more about Christ Table, you can visit that URL right there, www.christtable.today. And if you would like to know more about this Bible study and perhaps how you can join us on this journey, then would encourage you to visit go.christtable.today/reconstruct. That URL right down there. You'll find the reading schedule and all of the information that you need to know to be a part of this journey with us as we continue into the wall that Nehemiah has built and all of the events surrounding it. Now, today we come to Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 4 through 62, which is a excruciatingly long reading schedule for today. And why don't we just go ahead and jump into that reading? Whenever we come to Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 5 through 62, what we have here is a list of names, family names, as well as the number of people who were counted in that family. The Bible is kind of famous for having long lists of names and genealogies, and this is kind of a sister or brother to those genealogies in that it is a census of all the people who returned to the land of Judea after the Babylonian captivity. Now, you have permission to skip. Whenever I was younger, I felt as though every word in the Bible was equally important, and everything in the Bible had to be read verbatim, and I would find myself slogging through these names and these numbers, and I was having difficulty pronouncing all of these things, and it can wear one out, especially when the reading for today is so long. And so you have permission to skip any of those names and numbers that are in the census. Now, I don't want to say that they are unimportant, but I don't know that I would say that every word in the Bible is equally important to us today. Not to say that they're unimportant, but they're just not of equal importance. And so feel free to skip through those. Feel free to read them word for word, verbatim. Feel free to add up all the numbers to see how many people there were, check the math. Feel free to do all of that, but also feel free to skip it. But there are some very important things that I want to point out in today's reading. Now, it may well be that the census isn't of equal importance to everything in the Bible, but like I said, that doesn't mean that it's unimportant. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's unimportant to our journey through the book of Nehemiah. It's important that it's in there, and so let's find out why. Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 4. At that time, the city was large and spacious, but the population was small, and none of the houses had been rebuilt. Why? They've been working on rebuilding the temple and working on rebuilding the wall, working on getting the economy back up and running. And so it was community first, self second. That was the mindset. That was the expectation. There's a lot to be said for that, right? Maybe that's something that we could learn today to value as much as the Israelites valued the community. So, verse 5, my God gave me the idea to call together all the nobles and leaders of a city along with the ordinary citizens for registration. Now, we have said along the way of this journey that any time that Nehemiah raises God as being the catalyst for something, we kind of put a little question mark. That was an air question mark there, if you couldn't tell, question mark. We kind of put a little question mark next to every instance of Nehemiah referencing God. Why do we do that? Well, we do that because we have had some real questionable situations where Nehemiah seems to have said that God told him to do something, or indicated to the people that God supported something that we're not sure God did, and that even goes against things that God has said previously. So anytime we see now Nehemiah mentioning that God said or God told him to do something, kind of put a question mark there. Why would it be necessary for Nehemiah to say that God had told him to call together the leaders of the city along with the ordinary citizens for registration? Why would Nehemiah need, even if God had told him to do it, why would he need to say that God had told him to do it? Would there be any situation by which it would be a problem for there to be a census, for the city to have everybody registered and everybody listed? The fact that Nehemiah needs God and God's backing for this census should be a flare that says there is likely more going on in the story here. And there is. So let's stick a pin in that and keep moving along. I had found the genealogical record of those who had first returned to Judea, and this is what was written there. And so we are in this kind of three waves of people coming back to the homeland from captivity. The first wave happened back in Ezra, and that is what Nehemiah finds here, is the genealogical record of those who had first returned to Judah. So what they're trying to do here is identify those people who are coming back home who had been in captivity. Lots of people move around. There were people who did not get taken into captivity, and there were people who were coming back to Israel who were not originally from Israel. I mean, we're talking several generations here, and so people intermarried, people had children, families split, families came together, life moved on, and so there was a desire for there to be a record of who were the people that had gone into captivity, which families were those, and which of those families that had gone into captivity in Babylon were now coming back home. And so Nehemiah, years later, after the first wave of people come home, the second wave of people had come back to Israel, and now Nehemiah is saying, oh, I found a record of that first group of people that came back. And here it is. Here is a list of the Jewish exiles of the provinces who returned from their captivity. King Nebuchadnezzar had deported them to Babylon, but now they returned to Jerusalem and the other towns in Judea where they originally lived. So Nehemiah has found this list, and you can actually go back and find in Ezra where it was found. And so Ezra chapter 2, you're going to see the same list that now continues on in verse 7 here, almost to the end of the chapter. And you're going to see if you go down those lists, they are almost exactly verbatim the same. And so we can go back and find the same genealogical record that Nehemiah found in Ezra chapter 2. Now, the interesting thing here is, why would Nehemiah find it incumbent upon him to figure out, to deduce exactly who the real Jews were and exactly who the people who were not originally taken into captivity, who they were and where they were? Well, he wanted to find that out because he wanted to know who the true Israelites were. He wanted to know who the pure-blood people were. Now, this is a sticky situation which brings us to the question of why did he leverage God in order to figure this out? Well, because we have record, and the Israelites who were there would have known that we have record of not all censuses being from God and being for good, righteous reasons. 1 Chronicles chapter 21 marks out for us a story where David actually defies God by taking a census that isn't from God, but 1 Chronicles 21 actually tells us that it was Satan himself who was a proponent and gave the idea for this census. Satan rose up, verse 1 says, against Israel and caused David to take a census of the people of Israel. Verse 7 then tells us that God was very displeased with the census, and he punished Israel for it. There's always a reason. There's always a reason for the census. One of the most famous censuses, at least in the Christian story, is the one in Luke 2, which begins, in those days there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And so each person, each family came to the town of their birth for a census, which for the family of David was Bethlehem, which meant that Joseph, being the house and lineage of David, had to go to Bethlehem in order to register. Why was that census there? Not just so that they could have a record of all the names, but so that they could utilize that record of names in order to tax. That was the reason for the census from Caesar Augustus. Now, if you want to know more about David's census and what was wrong with it, then you can go to here, 1 Chronicles chapter 21. And if you want to understand why Nehemiah was taking a census, well, you can stick with us and keep reading. But I'm going to tell you the reason for it was, and I've already kind of hinted at it, was because Nehemiah wanted to know who the true Israelites were. There was now, because of this captivity, a sense of community, and one might even say a sense of elitism from those who had been in captivity. You go to war with a group of individuals and come back home from that war, you have experienced something that no one else has experienced. You have formed a bond with everybody who was a part of that experience that nobody else understands. Maybe you've been to war and you understand that. Maybe you haven't. This happens a lot of times with college. You go off to college, you have this experience that bonds you with those people, and you continue to cheer for that school's teams decades after you're gone from that experience. You go to war, you continue to hang out with people with the VFW. You have a commonality that was born through similar shared experiences. Here in Nehemiah, essentially what happens is those who were taken into captivity and then are returned home to the homeland are seen as being true Israel. People who were not taken into captivity, or people who intermarried, did not have that experience necessarily, or just didn't come back home, were not considered true Israel. And so this kind of reinforces this idea that we've been talking about, that Nehemiah's real goal was to separate out true Israel from the rest of the world and the rest of culture, to insulate it, to protect it. That's why Nehemiah built the wall. Nehemiah built the wall not because God told him to, or not for the safety or the security of the city as the primary motivation, but in order to keep those who were not a part of the true Israel out of the temple and out of worship. He wanted to keep it pure. And if this is sounding very World War II, Hitler's Germany, Aryan race overtones, there are some similarities here, I think, between this idea of purity in both of those very divergent stories. I don't want to connect those two, but I want to say that there are some similarities in that idea of a pure race, a pure religion. And in Israel, race and religion are the same thing. They're together. The government, the ethnicity, the religion are all one, are all tied together in the same thing. So Nehemiah takes this census record in order to know who has rightful ability to call themselves children of God, Israelites, and has rightful ability to have full status for worship in the temple. Anytime you try to define the true people of God, you're gonna get in trouble really fast. This is Nehemiah continuing to act and press forward his agenda. If the book had ended here, we would, or before this chapter, with the completion of the wall and the first few verses of chapter 7, if Nehemiah, the book, had ended there, we would probably not be able to be so sure of our thesis that the wall was built not for protection, but in order to keep people out and away from God. But because Nehemiah continues to make decisions now that enforce and reinforce the use of a wall for things beyond just protection, we can feel quite sure that this was the reason primarily why the wall was built. And anytime that you build walls, literal walls, or proverbial walls between God and humanity, you're out of God's will. Come to me, God says. Come and see. God, I don't think, was the one who told Nehemiah to do this census. And we're going to see Nehemiah begin to get in trouble. We're going to see this begin to collapse around Nehemiah and around the community. And in our own lives, I think that it is important for us to take an assessment of those times and those places and those things that we have done in order to create boundaries or barriers between God and God's people and others, and maybe even more specifically, ways in which we have tried to define who is the true people of God and who are not the true people of God. This happens lots of times surrounding politics. The true people of God vote this way. The true people of God support this candidate. The true people of God are aligned on this issue. This happens in denominations. The true people of God are Presbyterian. The true people of God are Baptist. The true people of God are Episcopal. This can happen even with churches. The true people of God in our city go to this church. The true people of God believe this theology. The true people of God act this way in the community. Anytime that we try to define who is the true people of God or who are the true people of God with the intent of being able to recognize who are not the true people of God, We're standing in Nehemiah's shoes. It's not a good place to be standing. Until tomorrow, happy reading.